Thank you for inviting me back for another year of World Lymphoma Awareness Day. I think one of the challenges actually in doing this year after year is trying to come up with a new topic each year to talk about, particularly where we've got familiar faces in the audience who have seen last year's topic. Probably this year, if anything, it's been a little bit easier. I think it's been an unprecedented year in terms of new access to medications. In the past, I've stood up here and I've spoken about an array of different new treatments that were in the process of undergoing clinical trials. But always the end of that discussion was about hopefully in the future we'll have access to these particular treatments. And I'm pleased to say really this is a very long list of medications that either have become available since I did this talk last year or are in the final stages of becoming available for us to use. Now, before I just go into a bit more detail about those processes, just a little reminder that pretty much every single treatment that we get access to is previously been studied as part of a rigorous clinical trial. And really that's the mechanism by which we get treatments from the benchtop, like the guys from TRI who are here today. The work that they do ultimately, hopefully, will have clinical relevance in terms of a treatment strategy that we will be able to use in clinical medicine. And we can never get access to a treatment unless it has undergone that rigorous evaluation. And it's not just in terms of a treatment working, it's all about safety as well. You could be fairly cynical and say that, in fact, perhaps the killing of cancers is not that hard. You can actually give massive doses of cytotoxic treatment and kill a tumour. It's trying not to do harm to the person that that tumour is contained within that becomes the challenge. So it's really can be quite tricky to find a treatment that targets the damage specifically at the tumour cells and leaves the host alone. So really most clinical trials that are undertaken involve the asking of a question. So you come up with a hypothesis, and that might be that treatment A is better than treatment B, or that the addition of treatment A to treatment B leads to a better outcome. And then ultimately the design of the trial then helps answer that particular question. Now there's a number of phases that happen in evaluation of treatments, ranging from what we call the phase 1 studies, and these are the studies where we have evidence of benefit perhaps in the mouse model, and then they're trialled for the first time in human beings. So generally the circumstance here will be a very small number of patients, typically with very advanced disease where conventional or standard treatments are no longer working, and the really stage of development at this point in time is to evaluate safety. Again, going back to that point I was making before, it's making sure that this treatment can be safely delivered in humans. And often what this process will involve is finding the correct dose. And as part of it, looking to see, well, is there any potential benefit? Does it work? And then ultimately with the next step, which is in phase 2, the trial is expanded to a greater number of people, now focusing a little bit more on does it work or not, but also again continuing to look at the role of safety. And ultimately the most important step in any sort of development of a new treatment is the phase 3 clinical trials. So these most often than not are what we call the randomised clinical studies, where you get randomly assigned to either get a new treatment or potentially a placebo, or the new treatment versus an old treatment. So it's randomly assigned, it's often blinded, so the people undertaking the clinical studies, like the doctors, the nurses and the pharmacists, also don't know which arm of the clinical study that you've been recruited onto. And that's important because not knowing which arm you're on, not knowing which treatment you're getting, means that we can't make decisions based on that knowledge. Now, even once a drug is accepted as beneficial and safe and comes into routine clinical practice, the follow-up of that medication doesn't stop. There have been some rare occasions where, in fact, as part of phase 4, so once drugs get used in clinical practice, that were found over years of follow-up, then in fact there is a degree of harm that can come from a medication. So sometimes it does take very long-term follow-ups before we actually start to realise some of the adverse effects that new treatments can create. So this is really just a schema of the process. So ultimately, as we work through the different phases of clinical studies, the role of how effective that treatment is becomes increasingly important. But the whole way through, safety remains just as important as efficacy. So for many people in this room, the question that can be asked is why be on a clinical study? And there are a number of potentially positive reasons for being on clinical study. I suppose giving back to science is important. So there's a spirit of altruism in participating in clinical studies. More often than not, you'll get access to a new treatment that may not be available routinely outside of the clinical study. So particularly if for some reason you have lymphoma or leukaemia that's behaving badly, the conventional medicines aren't working, then participation in the clinical study can help get access to a treatment which may be the new Butte treatment subsequently. One other advantage in clinical studies is the monitoring, the follow-up that you get as part of a clinical study is often far more detailed than you get in routine practice. You probably get a few more CT scans, you probably get followed up more closely, more blood tests. And for certain people, that closer follow-up can be of benefit. And so it sort of removes a lot of the thought processes that your doctor may have, because a lot of the follow-up is controlled as part of the study. But there are reasons not to be on a clinical study. And ultimately, a lot of people don't like being guinea pigs, which when you are in a clinical study, you effectively become. So clinical studies aren't for everybody from that perspective. One of the advantages can also be a disadvantage. So because of that closer, more rigorous follow-up as part of the clinical study, you may end up being put out more often, have to come up to the clinic more often, get CT scans that might otherwise not be necessary. The other problem is that ultimately there may not be a trial available that suits your circumstance. Trials by their nature like to recruit reasonably fit, otherwise healthy people onto the clinic, onto them. So generally your kidney function needs to be good, your liver function needs to be good, your blood counts need to be reasonably good. And as I was pointing out before, given a lot of clinical studies of people with relatively advanced disease, often the underlying organ function isn't as good as the clinical trial requires. So you may not always be eligible for the clinical study that you might otherwise wish to go on to. Now the other thing also is that when we interpret the results of early studies on new treatments, they often don't look very good. And that reflects the fact that many of the patients who go on to these studies are in a circumstance where that trial may be their very last opportunity for any treatment. And so it means that sometimes they're the worst risk people. So the population of people who you would expect to have perhaps the least benefit from the drug. So even small suggestion of benefit in early clinical studies is enough then to sort of progress the drug forward to the higher phases of study. So I think a lot of us in this room, and doctors, patients, relatives, get a little bit frustrated sometimes with what we perceive to be slow access to new medication. Particularly if any of you participate on some of the forums, you probably, if any of those forums are American, it seems to be that the Americas and European populations get access to treatments faster than we do. It is to an extent true, but it's also, at least in part, because our government does have a very safety-first mentality to trials. And one of the differences is it's ultimately our federal government who picks up the tab for many of these new medications, whereas in fact in America, for example, it's often the health insurance companies that foot the bill. So it's a very different financial imperative. Now, one of the tricky things, there's sort of many layers of bureaucracy that are involved in getting access to medication. Probably the most important one is really the PBS. So essentially the PBS is a mechanism by which medications get reimbursed. A lot of these medications are prohibitively expensive, so they're very hard to pay for them yourself. So the PBS at least provides expensive medications at a very reasonable cost. But they also need to make sure they're getting bang for the buck. Ultimately, taxpayers' money is involved, so there's a lot of negotiation that happens to try to get the price of new medications down. So but even before a drug can become available on the PBS, it needs to be licensed. So this is where the TGA, or the Therapeutics Goods Association, have a role to play. So basically the TGA assess the quality and safety of medication, and if they believe that a treatment looks like it's safe and effective, then the TGA will provide a licensed indication. Now, there's a couple of other arms of government, including also this one here, so the Pharmaceutical, Health and Rational Use of Medicines. This organisation keeps a bit of an eye on doctors to make sure that we actually are utilising treatments in the way that they're meant to. And that's important in terms of if it looks like there's too much of a particular drug being used, they have a look and see why that's actually happened. Now, all of these organisations are meant to be relatively apolitical. So in the rare circumstance where, say, a Prime Minister changes midterm, you shouldn't expect too much of an effect on the ultimate decision making. So it's largely independent of government. But government have representatives on each of these committees, so that at least they've got a say in what's going on. So as I say, so the TGA basically makes an assessment of the efficacy and safety of a treatment, and then they will come up with a very specific indication for which that drug will be then licensed to be used. An example may be for a drug like fludarabine, that fludarabine gets licensed for frontline treatment for CLL. So at that point, it means that we, as doctors, have access to use that medication, but it doesn't mean that it's funded. So for very expensive medications, it can be very hard to get access to it. What it also means is once it's licensed, the pharmaceutical industry can now market that particular product. So the pharmaceutical representatives can come along and talk to us about their new product. What can also happen at this point in time is that the pharmaceutical company may set up a compassionate use program or an expanded access scheme. So you can get access to that medication before it becomes readily available on the PBS. Now, the PBAC are the organisation who make decisions about what treatments the federal government will put onto the PBS. So there's a whole group of different people on this organisation. There's health economists, doctors, pharmacists. There's also consumer representatives. So there's at least 2 consumer representatives on at any time. They're normally fairly important people, but not necessarily people who have a normal role to play in health. There can be many situations where a number of new treatments become available for the same indication, and then they'll have a stakeholder meeting to work out, well, how are we best going to use these new medications? And that's almost certainly something that's going to happen in the near future for some of the new treatments that we could get access to fairly soon. Now, there's a whole stack of different things that the PBAC take into account. It's basically, how well does the treatment work? How safe is it? How cost effective it is? It is said that the most important figure is that they need to have this figure called the quality of life years saved, and that needs to be $40,000 per quality of life year. So that it's a way of coming up with a health economic measure of how cost effective a treatment is. How severe the condition is, and also are there any other treatment options? So if you have a new drug for a disease for which there are no treatment options, and that disease is life-threatening, that treatment will almost certainly get funded, even if it's really expensive. If it's a new treatment that's really expensive, coming into an already crowded market where there are lots of treatment options available, then that becomes more challenging and requires a lot more negotiation. So there's a number of different listings that then actually happen. The Section 100 is a very specialised listing which many of our treatments, because they're very expensive, end up being listed under. So that's Section 100 of the National Health Act. And so these are treatments that normally can't be dispensed at your average community pharmacist. These are treatments that are available through the hospital system pharmacies. They're normally treatments that are going to be deliverable intravenously, for example, like many of the chemotherapies that we use. And even within the Section 85, the more standard medications, they actually can make it very hard to get access to some of them by requiring us to ring up and get authorities and having very strict indications for which we can use them. So that's really the processes which we go through to actually get a treatment that becomes available. And so it gives you a bit of an idea about why the length of time before you start reading about a treatment and how good it may be in a clinical study, and our ability to use it in routine clinical practice. So the TGA PBAC negotiations take about 9 to 12 months most of the time. The clinical trials and getting the information that a drug actually works on average takes 5 to 10 years. So there is that unfortunate but necessary delay before treatments become available. So since I last gave this talk last year, these are 3 new treatments that are now available through the PBS. So they're funded and we can use them generally under very limited circumstances. As of the July meeting of the PBAC, Bendamustine has had a positive recommendation, so that's now been moved forward to the Health Minister to consider when that will become available, hopefully the 1st of December. We've got these 2 treatments, ibrutinib and idelalisib, that have had TGA licenses approved, and 2 new checkpoint inhibitors. Steve mentioned sort of checkpoint immune inhibition before. So these treatments look quite extraordinary in the setting of particularly Hodgkin's lymphoma, but a number of other solid tumours, in fact, where the evidence is a little bit of ahead of the game in lymphomas. So really I just want to work through these particular treatments. There's going to be a lot of data. Don't try to take it all in. I think just really the message is that we've come a long way in 12 months. And as I said, this is quite an unprecedented 12-month period. So Bendamustine is a treatment I've mentioned at previous World Lymphoma Awareness Days. What's unusual about Bendamustine is it's a type of chemotherapy. It's not one of these monoclonal antibodies like MabThera or other molecular inhibitors that we often talk about. It's old-fashioned chemotherapy. And in fact, it was really pioneered in East Germany before the Berlin Wall came down, and was used very extensively in East Germany at that time. It was incredibly cheap. The moment the wall came down, capitalism got hold of the treatment and the price went up about 1,000-fold. So it's actually a relatively old drug that had never been studied, but in fact we've had some increasing data coming through suggesting its very clear benefits, and in the background a lot of negotiation to try to get the price down. So what's important about Bendamustine, it's got a dual action. So it has an alkylating activity like cyclophosphamide, that's one of the standard drugs in many of the chemotherapies that we use. So the C in CHOP, for example, or C in CDP is cyclophosphamide. But also has a treatment, a mode of action similar to fludarabine. So it works through as a purine analogue as well. So really one drug has potentially the role of 2 different chemotherapy drugs. So the most important data was the Stil study, which was a study that the German Non-Hodgkin study group led and then became a worldwide study. And essentially it's one of those phase 3 studies. You got randomised to either get CHOP in combination with MabThera, or you got Bendamustine with MabThera. So effectively the Bendamustine was being randomised against 4 other chemo drugs. And again, it was blinded, so nobody knew what treatment you're actually getting. And this is the progression-free survival curve. So basically, if you're progression-free, that means at the time of last follow-up on the study, you've not relapsed. And if you do relapse or progress, then the curve goes down. And so basically, 50.5 is where 50% of people are still in remission, so progression-free. So the blue is for the R-CHOP group. So you see here that by 3 years post-treatment, 50% of people in the CHOP-R group had evidence of progressive disease. Whereas if you follow the arm across, it's virtually double that length of time. So 6 years in the Bendamustine rituximab group. So you've got a single new chemotherapy that replaces 4. Now this is progression-free survival. It's not overall survival. If you look at the overall survival curve, so does this drug make you live longer with your low-grade lymphoma? The answer is, at this stage, not, according to the scientific data. Now, what was also interesting was that this study just looked at low-grade or indolent lymphomas. They didn't specify a particular subtype. So when they actually analysed it based on the different types of low-grade lymphoma that we see, so this is the follicular curve, this is the mantle cell lymphoma curve, the marginal zone lymphoma curve, and the Waldenstrom's curve. So in fact, in all 4 of the subgroups, there was benefit. So the treatment just didn't work in a particular type of indolent lymphoma. It worked in all major groups. Now, there was a similar study that was performed as a collaboration between the British and the Americans called the BRIGHT study. Essentially, a similar sort of trial where you were randomised to receive bendamustine and rituximab or either CHOP or CVP, and each individual centre could determine whether they wanted to do CHOP or CVP. Now, this is what we call a forest plot. So basically, if these lines to the majority to the right of this line here, that means bendamustine is better than the standard of treatment. If it's to the left, that means the old-fashioned treatment is better. If it crosses the line, that means it's not statistically significantly different. So all of these lines really very much favour the bendamustine group, but not in a statistically significant way. So this study didn't meet the primary endpoint. It wasn't clear that bendamustine was sufficiently better. But the government were happy enough that in this study, in combination with the Stil study, that bendamustine was a good treatment to pay for. An example of a different disease, so when it's used in CLL, in older unfit people, so where fludarabine-based treatment wasn't considered to be suitable, it had an overall survival advantage compared to chlorambucil, which is one of the gentler treatments that we've got. So it worked better and it was very well tolerated. And that was one of the important points that the government looked at, was that in the CHOP comparison study, bendamustine is far better tolerated. It causes less problems with blood counts. There's no steroids, so you don't get all those horrible side effects that most people get from high-dose steroids. Now, so the TGA licensed bendamustine about 2 or 3 years ago. So it was, and that was basically for first-line treatment of CLL, the low-grade lymphomas who'd never had any previous treatment, mantle cell lymphoma, but also for relapsed and refractory lymphoma. Now, the company who makes it didn't apply to the PBS for all of these indications. What they did apply for was basically for frontline treatment of low-grade lymphomas. So that's all of those ones that we saw: Waldenstrom's, follicular lymphoma, marginal zone lymphoma, and mantle cell lymphoma. And the government were happy to reimburse it for all of those circumstances. So hopefully as of December 1st, we will actually have access to this on the PBS for these indications. Now, in the relapse setting, the company generally has allowed us access to it. One of the problems is that the company won't pay for it, though. There are some circumstances where the company will foot the bill for the treatment. So this is one of those circumstances. If we want to use it, the company will give us access to the treatment, but the hospital or the user will have to pay for it. Now, it's about $16,000 for 6 doses, or 6 cycles, which is 12 doses of bendamustine. So it's relatively expensive.